So we have another interesting panel, and without any further ado, we'd like to move into it straight. This is about business continuity, building resilience for the future. As the world reels from the massive impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, business continuity planning has become one of the most pressing topics that organizations must revisit. Although the importance of BCP was well understood even before this pandemic, this time around, global business disruptions caused by the pandemic have stress tested it way beyond its preset parameters. The post-pandemic world not only requires transformational change in the way they approach business continuity, but organizations must be predictive and proactive in their decision making to preserve business continuity and build enterprise resilience in order to adapt and thrive in a changing environment and be fit for the future. Chairing this panel is going to be Arunabh Mitra, Chief Continuity Officer and Crisis Management Leader at HCL Technologies. Welcome on board, sir. Our panelists for the session, Vishal Jain, Partner Risk Advisory at Delloite India. Sanjay Kothary, Chief Risk Officer at LTIMindtree. Hareesh Prabhu, Strategy and Transformation Leader at Philips Innovation Campus, Philips. So that's the panel for you. Next, please join us, welcome them on board. And with this, we'll hand it over to...
Extremely privileged to be here in front of you and with my esteemed panel. Like she just said, as the world recovers from COVID-19, business continuity seems to be a very pressing topic for all of us to revisit. And in a post-pandemic world, this topic needs transformational change in the way we look at it, and also not only to evolve it on the lines of its traditional parameters, but also how to actually evolve it from operational resilience to strategic resilience. The topic for today's discussion is linked to technology, which is the theme of today's day, NASTech session, but is not limited to technology alone. Before we jump into the topic or the panel discussion, I have a few slides to do context setting for all of you. This slide is about the world which we live in. Out of the 8 billion people who live in this world, most of us afford a lifestyle which none of the 2 billion which inhabited in this world in the 19th century could even imagine. Thanks to development, thanks to inter-country cooperation, thanks to innovation, we can afford many things which our ancestors could not. And all of this is thanks to globalization and urbanization. Having said that, our world is also a reflection of globalized networks of connections and interlinkages. And these connections, on the one side, provide us with progress. On the other side, they also provide us with a continuous stream of disruptions or disruptive events. And these disruptive events come in both fast as well as slow trajectories. When I say fast, think about an earthquake, think about a flood, think about a fire incident. When I say slow, think about homelessness, think about poverty, think about climate change, right? It almost seems that the globalized system which we have created in the last 50 to 70 years are also the systems which are the routes which disasters are also taking, and they are not just limited to progress alone. Now, In the past 2 years, thanks to COVID and thanks to some of the other global developments, global disruptions which the world has seen, resilience planners across the world, their jobs have become very difficult. If I have to give you a very quick flavor of what we are seeing in the world across 3 time horizons, the immediate, the next 1 year, and the next 5 years, this is how it looks like. Disruptive events are emerging from issues which are defying traditional risk analysis methodologies. See what happened to FTX two weeks back. The story is still unfolding. See what's happening at Twitter as we speak, right? The British Prime Ministership hit a record of being the shortest regime since, I think, 1813. These are kinds of incidences which we haven't seen before. The speed, the volatility at which they are hitting, we were not privy to. Let's take a 12-month outlook. This is the risk landscape for 2023 based on the Economist Intelligence Unit. I'm not going to read through all of them, but some of them we already know of. But just to round it off, we're talking about an impending global recession. We're talking about maybe, hopefully not, a more aggressive variant of COVID-19. There could be energy crisis which can fuel social unrest, and there could also be the Ukraine war turning into a global conflict. Again, hopefully not. And if I move to the next 5 years outlook, this is the World Economic Forum report. Again, known devils, but time to think about them. There's climate action, there's extreme weather, there's geo-economic confrontation, and so on and so forth. So this actually brings us to the topic of today's discussion. The craft, the art, and the science, which we're going to talk about today, is called business continuity. And the science of this continuity has been evolving fast for the last 20 years. Again, thanks to various disruptive events which we've seen, right from the 9/11 attacks to the Northern Grid failure to the financial crisis which the world witnessed, and then accelerated off late through COVID and so on and so forth. And what started off as the so-called emergency response moved on to become cyber resilience, and now companies are talking about organizational resilience, which is of very different altitude. So that kind of sets the context for today's discussion. We are here to navigate a new kind of complexity, and what next is really the context of our discussion over the next 20 minutes or so. So, I'm going to start off with Vishal, who is leading the crisis and resilience practice at Delloite. With my first question, Vishal, you've been in this space for quite some time now. You've had the experience of dealing with a very diverse set of clients, right, from large enterprises to small and medium to startups. From your vantage location, what are the key learnings which the world has learned, either from the pandemic or from some of the geopolitical and other issues which the world is witnessing, which you think should be primary drivers into how do we configure continuity for the future?
Yeah, thanks, Arunabh, and thanks to the NASCOM and the other the event partners here to put this topic, because it's very close to my heart and it's required. And it's time that we all should accept and understand the importance of resilience, not at an operating layer, but at a strategic layer. So that's the first thing, and which is where the entire flow is moving toward the organization. Now, unfortunately, as a human being, we all have to, first fall and then get up to learn something new. And that's been the, since childhood, we have been doing that. And unfortunately, today also, when things like 9/11, 26/11, Chennai flood, Mumbai flood, Bangalore flood, and then the COVID came into picture. So after that, we suddenly realized that this importance has really picked up. And if I talk about few things about COVID, the way I call it is like not to call it as a good crisis, but why it is good crisis in the sense that everybody was going through it. So it was easy in a way for the other customers and people to make them understand what are we going through it. So that way there was some bit of, I would say, positive aspect where people really don't have to really work hard to explain to other people. But few things changed. We were forced to work from home or work from anywhere. And then we evolved from that. And today we are in a optional mode of hybrid model, which means we have both the options. Now, with this new operating model or a business model coming into the picture, the entire threat landscape being remain same, but actually if you see people working from home, the control in their work environment, which is the workplace, like we call it from a Delloite point of view, we typically call it as workforce and workplace. We realize that the workplace is out of enterprise control. We really don't know how the threat environment, what are the control there. Then you are talking about some of the sensitive informations like your privacy, cyber security coming into the picture. Then you are talking about the multi-events or multi-threats coming together. For example, your COVID was going on, then there is your power outage, then your network outage. So there are multiple events coming into the picture. So point what you realize is that your traditional way of looking at the threats and threat assessment needs to be relooked, which means the approach needs to be changed. New parameters can be added, and for example, relatability as a parameter, because we never thought of flood in some of these cities, which has become a sort of a common thing. So that's one which we have to look at it. Second was that COVID also told us that there is no definite time of disruption or duration. It went for a long, that the temporary was all as good as permanent, and we are calling it as a new normal because it went for so long. So that was another thing. Then the threat also expanded with the recent event of the European, we are seeing that Russia and the Ukraine crisis which is happening, which also triggered that you cannot talk about, leave the geopolitical threats ignored totally and just focusing on your operating environment. And which is where the entire thought process or threat is graduating up at a layer which is talking about the organization and strategy. Because the geopolitical threats also triggered one aspect, and especially in the IT industry, is the concentration risk. And not only concentration risk in terms of that offices or the team is located in one, say, I would say a country, but even within the country, you can say at a micro level, they are located in one city or one geography, and when you have a disaster or anything in that part of the climatic issue, then you are suddenly people are out of action. So that also triggered. So it is, you are expanding the threat horizon, you are adding complexity of your operating model, you have to relook at your entire landscape. So that is something which picked up. The other important, even at the technology layer, the huge dependency on the technology has triggered to relook at the technology architecture. Because now the traffic is exactly coming from outside into my premise. So what about the entire scalability and reliability of the technology layer, where I'm talking about the high, I would say, penetration of the collaboration tool in a virtual environment. So that becomes an important aspect as well. So this is all we are saying, that it is not just one component of a business continuity plan or a DR to be looked upon, but it is a very holistic strategic layer. You have to stitch all these various components which sort of got disturbed, or I would say like an equilibrium of the entire ecosystem is now really questioning about. And we have seen that. Why, one more example to touch upon the strategic layer is that even some of the small scale companies, see, this COVID still was sort of a large companies were able to resist it. But we have seen many of the not so, I would say, people who are focused on this subject, or even the smaller scale, some companies, they went into financial crisis, or there were mergers and acquisition which came into the picture, or they have changed their product line. So a lot of things to be learned in this aspect, and which is where we believe that this subject of resilience now has to be looked more futuristic with new threats landscape, new operating model, and then a holistic or a strategic layer.
I think that was a very good 360-degree articulation of how the threat landscape has evolved and the way we deliver our operations. Our new definition for at least the services industry, if not the manufacturing, the new definition of workplace has now become hybrid. And hence, how does the whole, the perimeter which we need to protect changes. Thanks, Vishal, for that opening act, if you will. I'm going to now kind of raise the altitude of this conversation a couple of levels higher and invite my colleague Sanjay Kothary, who is the Chief Risk Officer for LTIMindtree, to help us understand as to how resilience has become or is becoming a topic of importance in the boardrooms. How is it being felt and being pushed or being discussed top down so that it is affecting the strategy of the organization? Sanjay?
Yeah, thank you, Arunabh. And thank you to NASCOM and all the participants over here. So, if I look at the board and specifically, I would say the risk management committees of all the boards. If I look back and I think about, the risk management committee meetings that we used to have prior to the pandemic, they, were part of all the board meetings that you had on a quarterly basis. And quite frankly, in many cases, they were rushed through because most of the board was interested in, the financial results and making sure that, we met the quarterly numbers and things like that. As soon as the pandemic hit, I think the one big change that happened at LTIMindtree, and I think this may be probably common across all companies, is that the board decided that we're going to have 2 special meetings in the year outside of the regular 4 quarterly meetings that we have, so that the board members can focus on the qualitative risk management aspects. So after the pandemic hit, in our company, at least in LTIMindtree, now we have 2 board meetings in a year, 6 months apart, of the risk management committee that is focused exclusively on risk management topics, which includes, of course, business continuity, resilience, cybersecurity. Data privacy is becoming a big issue now, especially if you are working in Europe because of the GDPR laws. And so I think that's the biggest change in terms of the interest and the engagement of the board in these topics, which I think in the past were maybe glossed over. And once the board gets engaged, then obviously, the CXO at the CXO level, there is a lot more seriousness, and we can see it penetrate down to the organization level. So I would say that's number one, is probably the biggest change in terms of, just the focus and the attention. The second thing that's happened is that the scope of the risk management activities has expanded dramatically. So now what we discuss, because as Vishal kind of alluded to, it's not really, it's really about strategic risks. And it's really about, looking at business resilience as opposed to simply, do you have the right disaster recovery strategies and, all of the stuff that we've kind of focused on in the past. So I'll give you a couple of examples where now in the risk management committee we are actually talking about. So one is on employee attrition, right? Never before, I think, in my past career, did we talk about employee attrition in terms of the risk management committee. That was always a separate topic, driven by HR, whatever. But at least in the IT industry, as many of you all are aware, that has become a huge issue. And now we have to present to the board at the RMC level, and I work closely with our HR head to kind of see what we can do to mitigate the risks that come out of employee attrition. The and just so I think what is happening is the companies are elevating the discussion of risk management and business continuity to topics that were probably not in the domain of the classic risk management and business continuity functions. So I'll stop over there at this point in time, but that's kind of, I would say, the 2 main differences.
In any triggers you're getting from either customers, investors, or regulators per se, you means not LTIMindtree, but generally as such in the industry, which you think is prompting the boards to take a deeper look at resilience as a dimension of importance?
Yeah, so I mean, certainly from the customers, we're getting a lot of interest. And I think across the industry, business resilience, business continuity has now become sort of a pre-sales discussion, right? That
Right.
you won't even be considered,
It's like table stakes.
until you are able to convince the customer of your business resilience and continuity. So I'm beginning to have a lot more customer meetings, than I used to in the past, and I think that's true for all the entire industry. So there's a lot of push from the customers. I don't see as much of a push on the regulator because, primarily because the IT industry, thankfully is still lightly regulated. So I don't see too much from a regulatory perspective, but just from a business, confidence level perspective, I think the board is pushing it.
Makes sense. Yeah, I agree. That brings us to the next question, which, we are in a technology conference and no conversation would be complete without a technology dimension to it. So allow me to welcome Hareesh Prabhu, COO and Head of Strategy and Transformation at the Philips Innovation Lab. Hareesh, welcome again. So my question to you is, how do you perceive as the role of technology in enhancing resilience in today's enterprise? I mean, it's a broad question. I know this topic itself can take all of 30 minutes, but any nuggets of wisdom you want to share with us?
Sure. Thanks, Arunabh, for a nice introduction, and thanks NASCOM, and thanks to each one of you for still being very attentive after a very good lunch. I think pre-COVID, there was about, I'm just referring to a survey. We can always take the outcome of a survey with a pinch of salt, but pre-pandemic, I think there were about 11% of the global organization which did not even have a BCP in place. And during the pandemic, it is well acknowledged fact that almost 1/3 of the organizations did say that, yes, I did have a BCP, but I never imagined that it would be tested to this extreme, right? We all knew that a flood would occur maybe a few days or a week, but something that runs for a couple of years was unheard of, at least in our professional career. Now, having said that, and having gone through this prolonged period of crisis management, I think few things have clearly stood out. So the first thing, I will talk about the challenges which we can relate to in terms of the technology solutions. The first thing that comes to our mind is, I think, in the hybrid way of working, which is here to stay, there are many people who have started using a lot of unapproved software tools at home. Right? It becomes very easy for me to transfer a large size of file, instead of going through VPN and all kinds of the IT restrictions. Or I am in a Scrum team, so I have an online Scrum board, so I'll just go and use it, or I'll just use a DM board that is easily available to me. So all of this pose additional risk on top of the challenges that we are already dealing with. That's point number one. Point number two is very similar to that, is the IT peripherals that nowadays are very easily available. I can afford, I can buy. I feel that it is plug and play, but then that poses a lot many risks for us as a business continuity. And the next thing is, I think we all know that the meeting rooms used to be a simple table, chair, and maybe a projector, a VGA or a HDMI projector. But now if we really see, the meeting rooms have become real sci-fi kind of a meeting rooms, right? So the collaboration tools and equipments are real big time investment for all of us. So technology is really enabling hybrid as we go forward. And last but not the least, I think the most important thing that technology will play a role. I'm from Philips, which is primarily into healthcare and health tech domain. I think there are a lot of solutions that have evolved with an assumption that these kind of scenarios are bound to happen in the coming days. Just to give a few examples, I think at least in the regulated industries, over-the-air updates, right, what we call as OTA, were not that very prevalent, but now it is very, very prevalent. For a remote service engineer, how easily he can diagnose a system sitting in the office rather than going to a hospital. Right? I was just talking to Vishal a while ago that how during the COVID, technology solutions have evolved. For example, we have created a solution where there is a radiology command center, so which means a radiologist sitting in a command center would know how my MR is operating, how many scans is it making, how a CT department is working, what is the time that is, elapsed between a person entering versus person coming out. How can I optimize the whole radiology department to ensure the maximum service I can offer? I think there is, as Arunabh said, there is a lot that we can talk about, but I think BCP, in collaboration with the disaster recovery plan, going hand in hand with the IT solutions and the real-time software solutions. I think that's the way forward.
Thanks, Hareesh, for that perspective. I'm going to now switch gears a little bit. We talked about business continuity, to Sanjay's point that it's becoming a boardroom agenda. It already has. That's the background with which is my second set of questions to my panelists. I'll start with Vishal again. Vishal, business continuity is still perceived as a dimension of operational resilience. However, some of the leading companies in the world are now trying to look at operational operational resilience with a broader lens. And they're calling it strategic resilience or organizational resilience. In your view, how relevant is that topic? Is it the next fancy thing, next shiny thing around the road? Or is that something which is going to gain eminence and traction? And do you see leading organizations already making a pivot towards it? So what's your independent view on that topic?
Yeah, so I think thanks for bringing that up. So first of all, let me take in two parts. One is that operational resilience itself is, I would say, like a BCM 2.0, like any other 2.0 we have in this world. Let's call it BCM 2.0, where operation resilience, instead of starting like you do a BIA for a process, here you are starting from the business. So you do an impact analysis right from your product and services. You extend the threat environment to cover the larger ecosystem rather than your only enterprise and extended enterprise. So that's the second one. Third is, instead of just going very pinpointing the RTO, RPO type of parameter, you are getting into your tolerance limits and impact objectives, which is a more, I would say, objective in a business oriented manner, which means that if I need, for example, in a bank, if my retail banking is the most important product which should be up and running, then my impact tolerance limit could be what is the percentage of customer who should be able to serve. So where you are redefining the entire impact objective and tolerance limit. So that is the graduation within the BCM at an operational resilience. Now we are talking about some of the other factors, which are, what if the license to the business itself is questioned, which means everything in operating environment is fine, but something somewhere happened which has impacted and you are not able to operate. It could be a political issue, it could be a visa issue, it could be some regulatory change, and which is where all this comes into picture. And that's why some of the components like your reputational resilience, your ESG related requirements, these are also coming into the picture and not only restricting to operational resilience. And one very important point, again, we have to going back to the trigger of the COVID event, which we all went through, is the people resilience angle, which is also forming one of the major, I would say, capital or pillar of the organization resilience, which means people resilience two part. One is the employee resilience, which means an individual in himself, how much is resilient because of the entire changing the operating model. And then we all have gone through that mental being type of issue. The other is the workforce resilience, which means that if people are scattered across the geography, then can I, how I am able to distribute and less dependent on one set of team in one set of location. So that's the two parts. So to answer your question, yes, it is not a fancy, but it is a need which we are looking at, because the way the threat landscape is evolving, we have to include parameters like people resilience, supply chain resilience, or organization, the operational resilience and all that into this.
Sure. Thank you. Sanjay, my next question is to you. Resilience is often misunderstood as something which comes at a very high cost. And sometimes some of the companies avoid making that investment, thinking that if they have to gold plate everything, it's not worth the effort. So is there any guidance you'd like to provide to our audience that, if investment is an issue, let's say for the small and medium enterprises, at sometimes it could be an issue where they wouldn't like to gold plate everything. Are there any fit for purposes use cases which you would recommend to them, which small and medium enterprises can go with very pinpointed focus to enhance their resilience?
Yeah, that's a that's a difficult question because one is that there is a cost towards investing, in resilience. And for a larger company, it's probably easier to bear that cost. And what COVID has taught us is that the cost of not investing is almost, your business itself.
True.
Right? So I think from a large company perspective, it is easier for us to sort of connect that dot and make appropriate investments. For a smaller company, I would say it's obviously much harder. And but the one thing that everybody should look at in terms of smaller companies is that there are a lot of outsourcing solutions that can provide you the resilience that you need, and at a very, very minimal maybe cost impact. So I'll tell you, somebody I know has a small software development business, just about maybe 150, 200 people. And they, prior to the pandemic, they basically had their own small sort of servers and data center kind of a thing within their office, because for them it was much cheaper than to go to a AWS or Google Cloud or something like that, right? Because it was cheaper for them to just manage it with the technicians that they had, etc., etc. But when COVID hit, that's when they realized that going to the cloud, even though maybe slightly more expensive, but not ruinously so, actually gave them a lot of these other benefits that they never used to think about. And so what I would suggest is that you start taking a look at some of these sort of, because in a small company, forget about strategic resilience and all that. I think, first step is to ensure that your basic business continuity itself is addressed, because I think in a lot of small companies that itself is not addressed. So start small, start with some small steps, and then look at some of these providers who will bundle a lot of the resilience kind of into their products and services that you may not necessarily value.
Right. Makes sense. Yeah. First things first, right? Yeah. Brings me to the last question of today's panel from the stage at least, and this is for Hareesh. Hareesh, again, I'm going to give you a very broad question, and you'll have to help us answer through some of your perspectives. And this is not just about resilience, but again, we will try to answer this from the lens of resilience, is the role of sense making, right? With so many things happening around the world today on vectors of today, tomorrow, and day after, how does one make sense of the most critical ones, and how do you then convert that into actionable items within your firm? Again, a very broad brush question, but I think it's extremely important not to get lost in the weeds or to let something pass by which shouldn't have been allowed to.
Sure. I think as the proverb goes, right? I mean, snow always starts melting from their exposed edges, right? So I think what we really tend to forget is that look at the exposed edges, right? I think I was just talking to Vishal earlier in the day that he's from Delloite, a very well-known consulting firm, and I'm from a product company. So in the heat of the moment, we approach one of these companies, and then they create a beautiful business continuity plan and a disaster recovery plan. It goes into the shelf, and that's where it lies, right? So I think that's the classic paradox of the whole business continuity exercise. Unless we are hit with a hammer on the head, I think we tend to put it on the back burner. So I think that is something that we really need to watch out for. And the last thing is, of course, we will never be able to list down A, B, C, D things will happen, and hence when it happens, I will do this. I think that's not, none of us envisage something like COVID, right? So in my opinion, I normally talk about these 4 levers that we always look at. So one is the commutability. Is my commutability getting hit? The second is communication. Is my communication, I mean, whether it is telephony, internet, or whatever it is. The third is my IT infrastructure, whether it is, because of the malware attack or any other server-related challenges. And the four is my physical, my office premises and the physical infrastructure, right? I mean, if you really look at these four pillars, a combination of these will always give us some way forward. So that's how I would look at it.
Sure. Thank you. I think you kind of summarized a very broad topic into, consumable nuggets, if you will. I can see that we just have time to take maybe one.
Can you just add on this one? The sense making, because I really like that subject especially. I think risk and resilience has to go hand in hand. It's no more that you do a risk assessment, you have a recommendation and you're done. And then you say resilience means BCP, double BCP DR and you're done. It has to be a risk and resilience. So the idea here is that when you identify your risk indicator, with a threshold converting into a crisis indicator, with a threshold converted into actual crisis hitting you. And if you're monitoring things correctly, and which is where your sense making comes into picture in terms of what are those parameters and data points which needs to be correlated and monitored so that I get some bit of lead time at least before the crisis hits. I mean, I think that is something we have to do, and that is the next generation of an integrated command center. If I can talk about that terminology, we should think on those lines.
Yeah, I think generating as much as possible lead time is the key. Yeah. I can see that we have just about a minute to take questions from the audience. Any questions from the group for this esteemed audience? From the panel, sorry. Okay, I'll take that as a no, but in my while you were talking, I think there are three takeaways to summarize the session. One is organizations are prioritizing resilience to better prepare for change. I think that's definitely something which we can take away from it. Number two is it's important to navigate disruption with agility as well as common sense, like Sanjay said. Do the first things first rather than trying to gold plate everything to reduce our risk and to stay competitive and continue to generate value in the long term. And the third thing is that call it enterprise resilience or strategic resilience, that has now emerged to be a boardroom agenda, and that's something which is only going to gain traction. I personally really enjoyed listening to all of you. Thank you for your very rich perspectives. And before I wrap up the session, today's hero is ChatGPT. For everybody who was not there in the first session in the morning, Debjani and Rajiv and many people talked about ChatGPT. So what I did during the lunch break to save time is actually ask ChatGPT to write a poem on organization resilience. It's a long poem. I'm going to read out just 4 or maybe 5 lines. In a world of change where threats and risks are ever present, organizational resilience is key to weather any storm or incident. With resilience, an organization can weather any storm that comes its way, from natural disasters to market disruptions. It can find a way to stay. So that's ChatGPT for you. And thank you once again for joining me on the stage. I do want to, on behalf of all 4 of us, thank Esther and Emma for being wonderful interpreters throughout the day. Thank you.